Our company prefers strategic partners, not charity investors. The sentence sliced through the ballroom so cleanly that even the string quartet near the marble staircase seemed to lose rhythm for half a second. Naomi Brooks stood beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Financial Gala with her hands still extended in the air, calm, steady, unshaken. Around her, camera flashes burst like tiny explosions against the gold-trimmed walls of the Manhattan Grand Regent Hotel. Charlotte Whitmore did not touch her hand. Instead, the white CEO adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and turned slightly toward the crowd of investors gathering near the Champagne Tower. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others smirked quietly into their wine glasses. One man near the press wall lowered his phone too late, already recording the moment. Naomi slowly lowered her hand without changing expression. No anger, no embarrassment visible on her face. Just silence. The kind of silence that made decent people look away and cruel people lean closer. Outside the 40-foot windows behind them, snow drifted slowly over Midtown Manhattan, soft against the cold blue glow of the city skyline. Inside, everything felt warm, expensive, polished, and carefully selective. Charlotte Whitmore thrived in rooms like this. Rooms where old money spoke softly and everyone else learned to stay grateful for an invitation. Her silver satin gown shimmered beneath the chandelier light as reporters gathered near the stage waiting for her IPO announcement. Whitmore Dynamics was everywhere lately. Business magazines, financial podcasts, billboards in Times Square. People called Charlotte the future of American tech manufacturing. They called her fearless, untouchable, elegant. But Naomi noticed something else the second she entered the ballroom an hour earlier. Fear. Tiny cracks hidden beneath expensive confidence. Executives whispering too carefully. Lawyers checking phones every 30 seconds. Investors pretending not to notice the tension tightening the room like invisible wire. Naomi had seen companies die before. They always smelled the same. Expensive perfume covering panic. Charlotte finally looked back toward Naomi with a smile so thin it barely counted as one. "Enjoy the evening, Ms. Brooks," she said coolly. "I hear Brooklyn has become very fashionable lately." A few people laughed softly. Naomi simply nodded once. "Congratulations on tomorrow," she replied. Charlotte's eyes narrowed almost invisibly at the calmness in her voice. That calm unsettled her more than confrontation would have. Naomi wasn't supposed to stand there composed after being dismissed in front of half the financial world. She was supposed to shrink, defend herself, leave embarrassed. Instead, she looked at Charlotte the way a doctor might look at someone ignoring serious symptoms. Quietly concerned. Charlotte turned away first. The orchestra resumed. Waiters moved through the ballroom carrying trays of smoked salmon crostini and champagne flutes. Conversations slowly restarted, but the energy had changed. People kept glancing back toward Naomi. Some recognized her now, not from headlines. Naomi Brooks rarely appeared in magazines, but in certain circles, people knew her name in whispers. Companies on the edge of collapse somehow survived after meetings with her. Banks delayed foreclosures. Debt disappeared quietly. Competitors backed away without explanation. Naomi never chased attention. She just rebuilt broken things while richer people took credit for surviving. Across the ballroom, Whitmore Dynamics CFO Daniel Mercer watched Naomi carefully from beside the stage. His face had gone pale beneath the warm amber lighting. Because unlike Charlotte, Daniel understood exactly who Naomi Brooks was. And unlike Charlotte, he knew what would happen to Whitmore Dynamics if she decided to walk away tonight. Naomi Brooks stepped out of the Grand Regent Hotel into the sharp December air with her coat folded neatly over one arm and snow collecting lightly against the dark curls near her collar. The sound of Manhattan traffic rolled down Fifth Avenue in long, restless waves, yellow cabs spraying slush beneath glowing traffic lights, while towering office windows reflected the storm clouds hanging low over the city. Behind her, the gala continued without pause. Laughter drifted through the revolving glass doors along with jazz piano and expensive perfume, but Naomi kept walking as though none of it belonged to her anymore. Her driver had texted twice already. She ignored both messages. Instead, she crossed the sidewalk slowly and stopped beside a street vendor closing up for the night. Steam curled from metal trays beneath the pale glow of a battery lamp. The vendor recognized her instantly. "Miss Brooks," he said warmly, straightening his knit cap. Cold night tonight. Naomi smiled softly. Cold enough to make New Yorkers honest for 5 minutes. The man laughed quietly and handed her a cup of black coffee before she could reach for her wallet. On the house. You always say that. Because you paid my brother's hospital bill 3 years ago. Naomi lowered her eyes slightly. I invested in his future. You saved his life, the vendor corrected gently. For a second, the noise of the city seemed to fade around her. Naomi wrapped both hands around the warmth of the paper cup, while snowflakes drifted beneath the streetlights like slow-falling ash. She had spent years learning how invisible kindness could become in places obsessed with status. Wall Street remembered billion-dollar mergers, but forgot the people who quietly stopped families from losing homes. They celebrated power, but rarely recognized restraint. Naomi understood that better than anyone. 10 years earlier, she had been sleeping inside the economics library at Howard University after overnight shifts cleaning office buildings in Washington, D.C. Her father drove city buses until diabetes destroyed his eyesight. Her mother worked double nursing shifts that left permanent shadows beneath her eyes. Naomi still remembered studying financial reports beside vending machines at 2 in the morning, while security guards pretended not to notice she had nowhere else to sleep. She learned quickly that money moved through America like weather. Some people inherited sunshine. Others spent their whole lives trying to survive storms they never created. A black SUV finally pulled up beside the curb. Marcus Reed stepped out from the driver's side wearing a charcoal wool coat and the patient expression of a man who had worked beside Naomi long enough to understand silence. You stayed longer than expected, he said carefully. Naomi glanced back toward the towering hotel windows glowing gold against the dark sky. I needed to confirm something. Marcus opened the rear door for her. And did you? Naomi slid into the warm leather interior while city lights streaked across the tinted windows. Whitmore Dynamics is running out of time. Marcus hesitated before closing the door. Daniel Mercer called 3 times during the gala. Naomi looked up slowly. Did he leave a message? Only 1 sentence. Marcus handed her the phone screen. Naomi read the message once. Then again, please tell me you are still willing to help us survive tomorrow morning. Naomi leaned back quietly as the SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the slow-moving river of Manhattan traffic. Above the city, snow continued falling in silence, while somewhere 30 floors above the street, Charlotte Whitmore stood beneath crystal chandeliers, smiling for cameras without realizing the ground beneath her empire had already begun to crack. Restaurants and subway stations without realizing entire corporations could collapse before sunrise. Her office smelled faintly of espresso and white orchids. Everything inside it had been chosen to project control. The Italian marble desk, the museum glass shelves, the framed Forbes cover hanging beside the fireplace. Charlotte believed appearances mattered because she had spent her entire life watching powerful people reward confidence before competence. Her grandfather built Whitmore Industries from old manufacturing money in Connecticut. Her father expanded it through political connections and private clubs where everyone looked the same and spoke the same polished language of inherited privilege. Charlotte grew up learning that power was not simply earned. It was protected, guarded carefully against outsiders. Especially outsiders who threatened the illusion that elite people were naturally superior. A soft knock interrupted the room. Daniel Mercer stepped inside, holding a tablet against his chest. His tie hung loose now, exhaustion carved deep beneath his eyes. Charlotte barely turned. Tell me tomorrow looks cleaner than tonight. Daniel hesitated too long. That alone irritated her. We lost another lender 20 minutes ago, he said carefully. Charlotte's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Temporary hesitation. Charlotte. Temporary, she repeated cold. Words landed harder than he intended. Charlotte turned away instantly, but not before Daniel caught the flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Just 1 second. Then it vanished beneath the polished armor she wore better than anyone. I do not need a lecture tonight, she said quietly. Daniel lowered his voice. Then listen to the numbers instead. Naomi has been quietly holding off 3 institutional exits for months. She negotiated with Singapore directly after our legal team failed. She convinced 2 banks not to downgrade us. Every time we started bleeding cash. He stopped himself. Charlotte slowly looked back toward him. What exactly are you implying? Daniel exhaled carefully. I am implying that the woman you humiliated tonight may be the only reason we make it to tomorrow afternoon." The room fell silent again except for the rain sliding down the windows in long silver streaks. Charlotte said nothing. But for the first time all evening, Daniel Mercer stood waiting outside the main conference room with a legal folder tucked under one arm. His face looked older than it had the night before. "Singapore delayed confirmation again," he said carefully as Charlotte approached. She kept walking. "Delayed is not declined. The markets do not care about the difference right now." Charlotte stopped beside the conference room doors. Frosted glass reflected the tension in both their faces beneath the sterile white ceiling lights. "Where is she?" Daniel blinked once. "Naomi." The silence lasted just long enough to reveal irritation beneath Charlotte's calm exterior. "I did not ask her to come." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You made that very clear last night." Charlotte pushed the doors open without responding. Inside, 12 investors and board members sat around the long black conference table beneath recessed lighting that made everyone look slightly pale. Phones buzzed constantly against polished wood surfaces. Someone muted a financial news segment playing silently on the wall screen. Charlotte moved to the head of the table and placed both hands against the chair in front of her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began smoothly, "today remains a historic opportunity for Whitmore Dynamics despite temporary volatility in overseas lending." The room stayed still. Nobody interrupted, but Charlotte could feel skepticism pressing against the walls harder than the rain outside. Then one board member cleared his throat. Richard Ellison, 70 years old, Connecticut banking family. The kind of man Charlotte usually handled easily. "Temporary volatility?" he asked. "Our institutional support dropped 12% overnight." Another investor leaned forward. "And social media is circulating footage from your gala." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "Footage?" The investor slid a tablet across the table. There it was. A close shot of Naomi standing calmly beneath the ballroom lights with her hand extended while Charlotte turned away in front of cameras. Millions of views already. Headlines moved beneath the clip in bold white letters. "Whitmore CEO accused of public disrespect toward black investor." Charlotte's jaw tightened. Almost invisibly. "This is irrelevant to company performance." "Not anymore," Richard replied quietly. "People are asking who Naomi Brooks is and why half of Wall Street suddenly seems terrified of losing her support." A faint pulse started beating behind Charlotte's eyes. Daniel remained silent near the far wall because he already knew what came next. Another executive spoke carefully. "We checked this morning. Brooks Capital quietly owns indirect influence across 3 lenders tied to our rollover." Charlotte slowly looked up. "Impossible." Daniel finally stepped forward and placed another folder onto the table. "Not impossible. Hidden." Charlotte opened the file. Inside were pages of financial structures, emergency bridge agreements, and private communications she had never seen before. Her eyes moved faster with every page, then stopped completely on one signature. "Naomi Brooks." Repeated again and again across months of crisis negotiations. Charlotte stared at the papers while the room around her faded into muffled silence. Outside the conference room windows, rain slid slowly down the glass like melting ice. And for the first time since building Whitmore Dynamics, Charlotte Whitmore realized she might not actually be the person who had been holding her empire together. At 9:12 that morning, the opening bell rang across Wall Street like a starting gun, and within seconds the first wave of panic hit Whitmore Dynamics. Red numbers flooded trading screens across the executive floor, while phones began vibrating nonstop against conference tables and marble countertops. Someone near the investor relations office dropped a stack of printed reports, papers sliding across the polished floor like scattered snow. Nobody stopped to help pick them up. Charlotte Whitmore stood motionless inside the glass conference room, watching the company valuation sink in real time across the massive screen mounted on the wall. 7% down, then 11, then 14. The room had become painfully quiet except for the soft electronic chime of incoming alerts every few seconds. Daniel Mercer stepped away from the table to answer another call, his voice lowered but urgent. "No, sir, we are still expecting confirmation from Singapore." "I understand." "Yes, I understand the exposure." He ended the call slowly and closed his eyes for half a second before looking back at Charlotte. That was Blackstone Ridge. Charlotte folded her arms tighter. "And They are pulling out unless liquidity stabilizes before noon. A long silence followed. Across the room, one board member quietly removed his glasses and rubbed both hands over his face. Another investor stared blankly at the falling numbers reflected in the lenses of his phone. Nobody looked at Charlotte anymore with admiration. Only expectation, waiting to see whether she could stop the collapse she had spent years convincing everyone was impossible. Charlotte moved toward the windows overlooking Lower Manhattan. Rain clouds still hung low over the skyline, turning the Hudson River dark gray beneath the morning haze. Ferries crawled slowly across the water while traffic lights blinked far below like tiny warning signals. Everything outside continued normally while inside her empire, foundations were splitting apart faster than she could contain them. "Get Brooks on the phone," she said finally. Daniel did not move. "We already tried." Charlotte turned sharply, and she declined the calls. Something cold passed through Charlotte's chest then. Not anger. Something worse. Irrelevance. She stared at the city in silence while another notification flashed across the conference screen. International lenders request emergency review of Whitmore exposure. One of the younger executives spoke carefully from the far side of the table. "Ma'am, social sentiment is getting worse." Charlotte looked over. The executive hesitated before turning his laptop toward her. Thousands of comments flooded financial media feeds beside the viral gala video from the night before. People were dissecting every frame, every expression. Some recognized Naomi Brooks immediately. Others were only now learning about her reputation in private finance circles. The comments repeated the same question over and over. Why would Charlotte Whitmore publicly disrespect the one investor keeping her company alive? Charlotte looked away from the screen almost instantly. Her reflection in the conference room glass appeared pale beneath the fluorescent lighting. For years, she had controlled every narrative around herself with precision. Every article, every interview, every carefully polished appearance. But this was different. This was not about image anymore. This was survival. Daniel's phone rang again. He answered immediately, listened for 5 seconds, then slowly lowered the device from his ear. Charlotte already knew by his face. "Singapore declined the rollover," he said quietly. The room seemed to lose oxygen all at once. One investor muttered a curse under his breath. Another stood and walked directly toward the exit without speaking. Charlotte remained still beside the windows, but her fingers tightened so hard against her sleeve that the fabric creased sharply beneath her grip. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There is still one option." Charlotte laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor inside it. "Naomi Brooks." Daniel nodded slowly. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the river while rain streaked down the conference room glass in trembling silver lines. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again with something unfamiliar finally breaking through the polished certainty she had worn her entire life. Fear. By late afternoon, the storm over Manhattan had finally weakened, but inside Charlotte Whitmore's penthouse overlooking Central Park, the silence felt colder than the rain ever had. The television mounted above the fireplace played financial news at low volume, while red market graphics rolled endlessly across the bottom of the screen. Analysts discussed Whitmore dynamics with the careful tone people used when speaking about something already dying but not officially declared dead yet. Charlotte sat alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows with one untouched cup of coffee cooling beside her hand. She had changed out of her office suit hours ago, but exhaustion still clung to her posture like extra weight. Outside, the city lights reflected across wet streets in blurred ribbons of gold and white, while snow melted slowly along the sidewalks below. Usually she loved this view. It reminded her that she belonged above the noise of ordinary people, above uncertainty, above failure. Tonight, it only made her feel isolated. Her phone rested face down on the marble table beside her. 12 missed calls from board members, 4 from legal counsel, 2 from her father, 1 from Daniel Mercer, and none from the person whose silence now controlled the future of her company more completely than any contract ever had. Charlotte leaned back slowly and closed her eyes. But the image returned immediately anyway. Naomi Brooks standing beneath chandelier light with her hand extended calmly toward her while cameras flashed around them. Charlotte had replayed the moment so many times already that she could now recognize details she missed before. Naomi's stillness, the restraint in her eyes, The complete absence of humiliation on her face even after being dismissed publicly. Charlotte understood power. She had built an empire studying how people reacted under pressure. Weak people lashed out. Desperate people begged. Arrogant people overperformed confidence. But Naomi had done none of those things. She simply lowered her hand and walked away with dignity intact while Charlotte remained surrounded by applause that now sounded hollow in memory. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass windows beside her, distorting the skyline into fractured light. Somewhere below, sirens echoed faintly through the city streets. Charlotte finally picked up her phone and opened the file Daniel had forwarded earlier that afternoon. Confidential agreements. Emergency lending negotiations. Quiet interventions she had never authorized because Naomi Brooks had handled them without demanding recognition. Charlotte scrolled through page after page in growing silence. 8 months earlier, Naomi had convinced a private lender not to freeze Whitmore payroll accounts during a manufacturing delay in Ohio. 5 months earlier, she negotiated with overseas partners after one executive scandal nearly destroyed investor confidence. 3 months earlier, she personally guaranteed a temporary bridge loan using assets from her own fund. Charlotte stared at the screen, her chest tightening slowly with something unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. Shame. Not because she needed Naomi's help, because she had never once imagined someone like Naomi could be the reason she still had a company at all. Her entire life had taught her to associate power with appearance. Old families, Ivy League rooms, carefully inherited confidence, people who looked and sounded like her. She thought success belonged naturally to those already closest to it. And now every document in her hands quietly exposed how blind that belief had made her. The phone buzzed suddenly in her palm. Daniel Mercer. Charlotte answered immediately. What? She asked softly. Daniel hesitated for a second before speaking. Naomi left a message with Marcus Reed. Charlotte sat forward instantly. What did she say? Silence crackled faintly through the line. Then Daniel answered. She said Whitmore Dynamics still has until tomorrow morning before the final lenders walk away. Charlotte looked out across the city again, but this time the skyline no longer resembled victory. Only distance. Long cold distance between who she believed herself to be and the truth, now standing directly in front of her. The next morning arrived gray and windless over Brooklyn, the kind of winter morning where the sky looked like unfinished concrete, and every sound carried farther than usual. Charlotte Whitmore sat alone in the back seat of a black sedan stopped outside a narrow brick building on Dean Street, while steam drifted from nearby subway grates into the freezing air. There were no cameras waiting here. No investors. No polished marble lobby. Just a small 4-story building with aging windows, a bakery on the corner, and a modest brass plaque beside the entrance that read Brooks Capital Advisory. Charlotte stared at the sign for several long seconds before stepping out onto the sidewalk. Her heels clicked softly against damp pavement while cold wind moved through the street, carrying the scent of coffee and fresh bread from the bakery nearby. She had come without assistance, without security, without the armor of public image she usually carried into every room. Inside, the building, warm amber light spilled across dark wooden floors and shelves lined with financial journals, local community awards, and framed photographs instead of corporate trophies. A receptionist looked up calmly from behind a small oak desk. Good morning. Charlotte removed her gloves slowly. I am here to see Naomi Brooks. The receptionist glanced toward the hallway behind her. No surprise crossed her face at all, as if powerful people showed up humbled every day. She is expecting you. Charlotte followed the hallway quietly while the sound of rain tapped faintly against old windows somewhere deeper inside the office. The conference room door stood partially open beneath soft yellow light. Naomi Brooks sat alone at the far end of the table reviewing paperwork beside a ceramic cup of coffee. She wore a dark green sweater instead of designer labels, her curls pulled loosely back while morning light rested gently against one side of her face. There was no performance in the room, no attempt to appear important, and somehow that made Charlotte feel smaller than any boardroom ever had. Naomi looked up as Charlotte entered, calm as always. Good morning, Charlotte. No bitterness, no satisfaction, just quiet acknowledgement. Charlotte remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, because suddenly she did not know how to begin. The silence stretched softly between them, while rainwater slid down the windows overlooking the street below. Finally, Charlotte pulled out the chair across from her and sat down carefully. "Your office is smaller than I expected," she said before realizing how foolish the sentence sounded. Naomi smiled faintly. "It is easier to hear people in smaller rooms." Charlotte lowered her eyes briefly. For years, she believed success needed to look expensive in order to matter. Yet sitting here now, surrounded by warmth instead of intimidation, she understood why people trusted Naomi in ways they never trusted her. Naomi closed the file in front of her gently. "Daniel told me the Singapore rollover failed." Charlotte nodded once. "The board believes we have less than 24 hours. Naomi studied her quietly for several seconds. Not with cruelty, with patience. That somehow hurt more. Charlotte inhaled slowly before speaking again. "Why did you help us?" Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair while the radiator near the window hummed softly against the winter cold. "Because your employees did not deserve to lose everything for executive mistakes." Charlotte looked up sharply. Naomi continued calmly. 3,000 workers across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey depend on Whitmore payroll. Some of them are caring for sick parents. Some are paying student loans. Some are raising children alone. Her voice remained gentle but steady. "I was never protecting your image, Charlotte. I was protecting them." The words settled heavily into the room. Charlotte stared down at her own hands resting against the table. Hands that had refused Naomi's handshake less than 48 hours earlier. Hands now trembling almost invisibly beneath the soft morning light. For the first time in years, Charlotte Whitmore realized she had spent her entire career confusing power with worth, while the woman sitting across from her had been quietly using hers to keep strangers alive. The room remained quiet after Naomi finished speaking, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than anger ever could. Outside the conference room window, Brooklyn traffic rolled slowly through wet streets, while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas against the freezing drizzle. Somewhere downstairs, the bell above the bakery door kept chiming softly as customers stepped in from the cold. Ordinary life continued without knowing. Two women sat upstairs deciding the future of a billion-dollar company. Charlotte Whitmore stared at Naomi across the oak table with an expression no one on Wall Street had probably ever seen before. Not confidence, not control, humility, real and uncomfortable. The radiator hissed gently near the window while steam curled upward from Naomi's untouched coffee cup. Charlotte looked down at her own hands again before finally speaking. "I misjudged you." Naomi did not answer immediately. She simply waited. Charlotte swallowed once. "No, that is not honest enough." Her voice softened slightly. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Rain tapped lightly against the glass behind them. Naomi watched her quietly, patient as always. Charlotte continued staring downward as though the polished wood table somehow made the words easier to say. "When I saw you at the gala." She paused briefly. "I saw your skin before I saw your value." The sentence hung in the room like exposed truth finally forced into daylight. Charlotte exhaled slowly after saying it, almost like the weight of years had shifted slightly off her chest. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, not offended anymore, just tired in a way that felt older than the conversation itself. "That has happened to me my whole life," she said gently. Charlotte looked up. Naomi's voice remained calm, but there was history inside it now. "My father used to repair buses in Baltimore. One winter he worked 70 hours a week while his eyesight kept getting worse because he was afraid to miss a paycheck." She folded her hands quietly together. People looked at him and saw a tired black man in a stained uniform. They never saw the person underneath. Charlotte listened without interrupting. "When he finally got sick enough to stop working, the bank nearly took our apartment. Nobody cared that he had spent 30 years helping keep the city moving. To most people, he was invisible before he even walked into the room." The rain outside grew softer, turning into mist against the windows. Naomi looked toward the street below before continuing. "That is why I started investing differently. I promised myself I would never become the kind of powerful person who only sees value in people who already look successful." Charlotte's throat tightened slightly. Every sentence felt like a mirror held directly in front of the parts of herself she spent years avoiding. Naomi finally looked back at her. "You built a strong company, Charlotte. But somewhere along the way, you started believing only certain people deserved seats at the table. Charlotte lowered her gaze again because she could not deny it anymore. Silence settled softly between them. Then slowly, Charlotte stood from her chair. Naomi looked up in surprise as Charlotte walked around the table and stopped beside her instead of across from her. For one long second she hesitated. Then Charlotte extended her hand carefully, not for cameras this time, not for appearances, just truth. I am sorry, Naomi. Her voice almost cracked on the final word. Not because I need your help, because I was wrong about you. Naomi stared at the hand quietly while morning light rested across both their faces through the rain-streaked windows. Then after a few seconds, she stood and accepted the handshake gently. No triumph crossed her expression. No satisfaction. Only grace. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as their hands met because somehow that simple gesture felt heavier than every contract she had ever signed. 3 weeks later, sunlight spilled across lower Manhattan in long golden reflections as people crowded the sidewalks beneath the towering glass buildings of the financial district, bundled in winter coats while taxis rolled endlessly through the afternoon traffic. Inside the New York Stock Exchange press room, reporters filled every seat beneath the bright ceiling lights, voices overlapping in waves of anticipation while camera crews adjusted lenses toward the stage at the front of the room. A massive digital screen behind the podium displayed the Whitmore Dynamics logo beside a new headline in clean silver letters. Strategic Restructuring Announcement. Charlotte Whitmore stood near the side entrance waiting quietly with a folder tucked against her arm. She looked different now. Not weaker, just less guarded. The sharp edge people once feared around her had softened into something steadier and more human. Across the room, executives moved nervously between reporters while stock analysts refreshed market feeds on glowing phones. Whitmore Dynamics had stabilized faster than anyone expected after Brooks Capital quietly secured emergency financing and reorganized the overseas debt structure. Financial media called it one of the most unexpected recoveries of the year, but only a few people knew the real story behind it. Charlotte glanced toward the hallway as footsteps approached. Naomi Brooks entered wearing a dark wool coat and simple pearl earrings, calm as always beneath the chaos surrounding her. Conversations lowered almost immediately. Some reporters straightened in their seats. Others whispered her name quietly to producers beside them. Naomi noticed none of it or pretended not to. Charlotte walked toward her without hesitation this time. "Good afternoon," she said softly. Naomi smiled faintly. "Looks busy in there." Charlotte glanced toward the crowded room. "They think this is about business." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "And what is it actually about?" Charlotte looked at her for one honest second before answering. "Learning the difference between image and character." The words settled gently between them. No cameras close enough to capture them. No microphones. Just truth spoken plainly at last. A stage coordinator signaled from across the room that they were ready. Charlotte nodded once, then surprised Naomi by stepping slightly aside instead of leading toward the stage first. "After you," she said quietly. Naomi paused only briefly before walking forward beneath the bright lights and rows of cameras. The room erupted instantly with flashes and shouted questions, but Naomi remained composed as she stepped beside the podium. Charlotte followed half a step behind her. Not ahead, beside. Reporters continued calling out questions about the restructuring deal, the emergency funding, the future valuation of Whitmore Dynamics. Charlotte listened for a moment before raising one hand gently for silence. The room slowly quieted. Then, without reading from the prepared notes in front of her, Charlotte looked directly toward the cameras. "Before we discuss numbers," she said steadily, "there is something more important that needs to be said publicly." The room became still. Charlotte turned slightly toward Naomi. 3 weeks ago, I failed to show respect to someone who had already shown extraordinary integrity, wisdom, and compassion toward my company and the people inside it." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly while flashes continued bursting across the room. Charlotte continued calmly. "Success means very little if you cannot recognize humanity when it stands directly in front of you." Silence followed her words. Real silence this time. Not fear. Reflection. Naomi looked out across the room where reporters now watched her differently than before. Not as a curiosity, not as an outsider, but as someone impossible to ignore anymore. Outside the exchange building, winter sunlight reflected against the glass towers of Wall Street, while people hurried through the streets below without knowing how close an empire had come to collapsing under the weight of pride. And as Naomi and Charlotte stood side by side beneath the bright lights, the cameras captured something far more powerful than a corporate recovery. They captured the quiet moment when respect finally arrived where prejudice once stood.